Welcome back to our 1,000-yard project rifle build, where for a total budget of $500, including the price of this rifle, we'll be turning a Savage Axis into a gun that I feel competent competing with at a 600-yard and a 1,000-yard match out at Tulsa's Red Castle Gun Club. Now naturally, it's going to take a lot of work to turn this into a rifle I feel comfortable shooting at those kinds of ranges. So, make sure that you subscribe to the Social Regressive so that you can see all the upcoming videos. If you like us on Facebook, you can see some behind the scenes footage. And then finally, this playlist is going to have everything that we do to this rifle. Now in the last video, we discussed why I picked a Savage Axis over some very good competition. The Remington 783, the Mossberg Patriot, the Savage Axis II, the Ruger American. I chose a base Savage Axis over those, mostly because of cost, but also because of the things that I know I can fix on here and the things that I know are right. So in this video, we're going to take a step back to the bench here, and we're going to take a look at the distinct advantages and disadvantages of the Axis and what we have to do to get this battle ready. Let's start off with just some general notes, and the first thing I'm going to say is pretty controversial. I find this rifle to be rather ugly. I think it's gawping. This is pretty typical of Savage, where you have this bolt handle that just kind of falls right off, and the whole effect is that the rifle ends up kind of looking like a hunchback. The stock is just kind of hanging off the back of this. It looks weird. But in usual Savage form, this thing is very light, it's comfortable, the balance is nice. And you might think that these little finger grooves were cut here just for appearance to try to take away from the basic tubular nature of the action, make it look like there's something going on, and you'd be partially right. But this is actually very functional. These things feel nice. And you can, as you can see, you get a lot of real estate up here, so you can easily get your hand back if that's the way you like to take your shots. If you want to get a bit more control on the forearm, you can easily grab out here. And then back on the trigger hand, these little finger cutouts work really well. The bolt throw, as usual, very slick. It's cock-on open, so there's going to be a little bit of tension when you first lift the bolt, but it's still very smooth. It's a push feed, and yeah, you don't have to worry about anything slowing down as things lock into place. It's going to be really smooth. Zeroing in on just the stock, I have to say that I think they did a really good job with this. Their previous budget rifle, the Stevens 200, had a very basic floppy stock, and this is not that. It's still pretty flexible, especially right up here on the forearm. It's just a little bit too easy to flex this forearm until it touches the barrel. It's free-floated all the way through here, and I think that as long as you're taking offhand shots, like I mentioned in the other video, I think it'll be fine. If, however, you're going to be putting this on a bipod or doing anything else that's going to stress that forearm, I wouldn't really trust to the stiffness of this forearm. As for the rest of it, yeah, it's all pretty comfortable. Now it is ambidextrous, like I mentioned in the other video, which is not really ideal. This is nice for hitting the mass market. It's going to fit everybody decently well. It's never going to fit anybody particularly well. The length of pull is 13.5 inches, and that's the distance from the buttstock right here to the trigger face. Now, for those of you that are taller, like myself, I'm 6'2", and I have pretty long arms, and I don't have all that much muscle, so I need a length of pull of about 14.5 inches to be comfortable. 13.5 is fine. But this is just one more reason why I'm going to throw out this whole stock and replace it with a laminate. The recoil pad looks pretty good back here. It's a little bit on the squishy side, but it's not too bad. I think this one would actually feel really darn good, especially if you're going to be shooting the 308 or one of the other kind of larger calibers. This is, I think, going to soak up a lot of the recoil. It has these cutouts here that aren't just for visual appeal. They're going to help to give a little bit, but still provide some structure with these little bands through here. The underside of this rifle is actually pretty interesting, and we'll get into this discussion when we're looking at the action. But we have a magazine down here, It's the usual double stack stamped magazine. It can hold, I believe, 4 rounds. So you can have 1 in the chamber, 4 in the magazine. And this is the short action. So anything that has 308 as a parent case, you're going to be able to fit 4 in this for a total of 5 rounds. The bottom of this is plastic, but it's the same stuff as the stock, and I expect that it's a pretty good plastic. One thing that people have complained about is this little tab right here that retains the magazine in the stock. And I could see if you were swapping out magazines a whole bunch, that might become an issue, but it doesn't really move all that much. I wouldn't expect it to snap off that easily. Right here, this trigger loop is not the usual metal trigger loop that you can pop off. This whole section is one piece. And this all comes out when you remove your rear action screw. Like I said, we'll take a look at this when we take a closer look at the action, because this is actually a really neat piece right here. I've removed the 2 action screws so that we can take a good close look at this action in the nude. Here it is. One of the reasons that Savage can offer such a good rifle at a decent price is that they keep their machining pretty simple. This is just a tube of steel with cutouts in the right places. And one of the brilliant things that they did with the Savage Axis to make it as inexpensively as they do is that they replaced the tang that they usually have. What we're looking at right here is an action from the Stevens 200. This is kind of based on the old Model 10. Still tube steel. It's going to look very similar. But when you get back here, you can see that the tang, this is still part of the action. All of this has all this machining going on through here. And down here what they've done is they've just chopped it off right here at the back, and they've put in this cast tang because you don't really need that. This right here does a fine job of holding the trigger mechanism and the sear, safety, all the good stuff back through here. One other really cool thing that Savage was able to do with this action is they were able to put this top strap in across the top of the action because there was a detachable magazine down here. Normally, with the Model 10s and Model 12s, they had to leave this top section open so you could actually load the rifle. In here, you wouldn't be able to easily get a finger in to load your rounds. But since it does have that magazine that drops out, you don't have to have this massive cutout, and you can get a little bit more rigidity up here. The action and the barrel both appear, instead of being blued, it looks like they have a phosphate finish on the entire thing. It's basically a parkerization process. This gives it a very flat black look, in contrast with the kind of shiny blued steel look that you get with the older Stevens or the Model 12s or any of the full Savage line. I mentioned that we were going to talk about this weird trigger loop and the fact that it's a part of this big section of the stock. Here's why. This action is both long action and short action. It's long enough to be able to feed your 30-06 and 270s, and eventually if they do magnums, that'll probably work just fine for here as well. And usually the reason why you can't do that, why you have to have 2 different actions, one for short action and one for long action, is the magazine down at the bottom. So what these guys have done is they have 2 different magazines. They have a short and they have a long. And what you can do is, using the same stock and using the same action, all you have to do is just remove this section of the stock if you want to go with a long action, and replace it with a different one that's just a little bit shorter right here. So it'll still retain the magazine, and it'll fit neatly into the stock you already have. You can actually order this from Savage, from what I've heard. Just order this part. You can get a magazine through Brownells or one of those other retailers, and then you have a long action gun, or if you want to go the other way, a short action. Let's take a look at the peculiar way that the action connects to this stock. You have a steel pillar at the front, and you have a steel pillar at the rear, and that's pretty typical. But what's missing is the usual recoil lug. Here on this Stevens, you can see that the recoil lug is sandwiched between the barrel nut and the action. And here there is no recoil lug. There's just a little cutout in the action right there. What they've opted to do instead is to put the recoil lug here into the stock, which is something that I had never seen before. I'd be curious to know if this was less expensive to machine or just why they did this, but hey, it seems to work, so no problem here. As we finish with this action, we might as well point out that they did do a little bit of something to try to make it look like it's not just a tube of steel. They did some pretty simple cutouts on each side. You have this great big slash across the top, and you have this flat cutout right here. And really, as far as I can tell, that is just for appearance, to help it not look quite so bad. You can see that slash extends on the other side too. Yeah, I don't think it really does anything, but it does help a little bit. If you are accustomed to Savage bolts, this will look pretty familiar. It just has a few changes. First off, there's now a cocking indicator on the back of the bolt right here. And gone is this great big cam on the back of the bolt, and it's been replaced just by this little piece that's attached to the actual bolt handle. Now up on the front, the gas lug is also a little bit different. You can see that this one is just a little bit fatter on both sides, and this one has a little bit of a cutout. But the neat thing is that it looks like the bolt head itself and the bolt face, these are going to be interchangeable, which is one of the great things about Savage. It's really easy to pop these off and change them out. So if you want to go to a different head size, like say you want to step one of these down to 223 or go in a magnum direction, then you can remove these bolt heads and replace them with others. In typical Savage fashion, you get a very nice steel extractor, and you get a plunger type ejector with a strong spring under there. I've never had a problem with one of the extractors. I did get into some overpressure loads and I damaged one of my ejector springs, but really that was my fault. If you're used to firing Savages, you probably already know that you get some primer cratering around that firing pin hole. So for those of you that aren't used to firing Savages, you might notice that it craters a little bit. That doesn't necessarily mean you're getting into overpressure. It just means that this bolt face is a little bit different. Like any other Savage, the tolerances between the bolt and the action are not actually all that great. It's pretty floppy. You can actually hear it click around as I move it. And this makes for good quick throws. You can easily get the bolt moving around, but usually this leads to a loss of precision in a rifle. That's the cool thing about Savage. They have this workaround right here, the floating bolt head, and I really think that this is what makes Savages as accurate as they are. What this does is it allows the lugs, it allows the whole head to remain flush to the cutouts here in the action, and if the bolt moves around, which it always does, it's going to pull down a little bit with gravity as you're shooting. If there are any weird forces, like say if you're laying on your side, or if the trigger is being pulled and things are just being pressed around in here, usually that's going to pull the bolt off some, but it doesn't matter because the bolt is only tenuously attached to the head. This is going to stay nice and flush. You're not going to change your chamber dimensions any, and this still gets a nice precise lockup. The barrel nut here attaches this 22-inch sporter weight barrel to the action. And the really neat thing about the barrel nut is that it allows us to get really precise head spacing without having to do all that milling gymnastics that usually have to go into a lot of actions to make the two made up really well. All you have to do is just take a barrel that's properly threaded, you just screw it on here, use your gauges, put the barrel nut on, and then everything should be head spaced properly. Now, the barrel here, since it is a sporter weight, it's going to heat up really quickly and it's not going to dissipate heat very well. This is going to be a pretty big problem in our competition because remember, we're going to be shooting 20 rounds at a time in a string, at distances of 600 and 1,000 yards, and I have 1 minute per shot maximum. So this thing is going to get hot, and this might lead to a little bit of dispersion as the match goes along. We'll see. I think that this is going to hold up okay because I have fired these sporter weight barrels. I've put many rounds through them in sessions before, and it's done pretty darn well. I think we'll be okay. The Savage sporter profile is a little bit different than you get on a lot of others. It's not going to be quite as whippy because it just doesn't get as thin as fast. A lot of time they just cut right in, and then you just get this pencil barrel all the way out to the end. This one is more of a gradual taper. It's more like a cone. Now, one of the other problems with this barrel for our use is that it's only 22 inches. I would much prefer something like this 26-incher back here. But that's not part of our project. We have to stick within our budget. We can't add new barrels. So we have something that's not going to get quite as much muzzle velocity, and it's going to heat up a lot. But I still think that we're going to be in pretty good shape. Now for the question that's on everyone's mind. What is this chambered for? Well, I'm not going to tell you. This is kind of a controversy. I'm really interested to see what you guys think of the chamber that I saw. Now, if your opinion deviates from mine, then you're objectively wrong. But if you'd like to see what I've chosen, go to the Social Regressive on Facebook, like us, and you can see some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that's going on. You can get a sneak peek at what chamber I've selected for this rifle. I've saved the worst for last. This Axis trigger is one of the worst production triggers that you can possibly buy. At the bottom of my list of triggers, there's the Mosin Nagant at the very bottom. There's the Bushmaster BA-50, which was just hideous. You would think that a big, expensive 50 caliber rifle would have a nice trigger. Nope. But in third place, there's this. When I first got it out of the box, I could have sworn the safety was still on. That's how heavy this is. I really think that this started pulling at 8 pounds. Eventually it broke in, and it was only pulling at 6 pounds. But even with that, that's a really heavy trigger, and there was a country mile of creep in this thing. You would just pull and pull and pull, it just kind of grind, and then eventually it would just kind of go off. You had no idea when it was going to do it. Now, thankfully, there are some great fixes for this trigger. First off, if you got the Axis 2, then congratulations, you have an AccuTrigger. But for those of us that got this base model Axis, there's another really good aftermarket trigger called the Rifle Basics, and that thing is really nice. I've gotten a chance to try one of those out. My father-in-law built a rifle that has one, and it is a sweet, sweet trigger. Now, I don't have the budget for that for this build. I have to keep everything within that $500. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fix this trigger. I'm going to get rid of the creep, I'm going to reduce the pull weight, and I'm going to add an overtravel stop so that we end up with a good competition trigger just using what came with the rifle. For those of you that are familiar with the Axis trigger, you can probably already see that I have made the upgrades. This trigger is already fixed. This thing is amazing. My father-in-law and I turned this into a really nice trigger, and you're going to love what we did to this. It's really cheap to do, too. While I would have preferred the Axis 2 with its better trigger, I think that this base model Savage Axis will do just fine. I expect it to be plenty accurate, and with a few modifications, I think this will do really, really well. The one thing that I wish that we could do on this budget, and I know that we can't, would be to replace this barrel with something longer, heavier, and maybe something match grade. Maybe that's something for another project. But for now, I think this will work just fine.